Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, who is Sadeh from CMU. At CMU, Norm is affiliated with so many departments and institutes that they don't want to even start listing them all. Norm is also a prolific company founder, and his most recent company now has 300 employees. It's working in the area of privacy instruction for companies. Myself, Sharat, Nalini are now working with Norm in the context of a huge DARPA project about IoT privacy. So we are now friends.
We've been friends.
Yeah, still friends. Yeah. We found out though that like 20 years ago, he was with the European Commission, and we may have been in a situation where we were at opposite sides. I asking for money, and he, as a member of the committee, kind of finding problems and turning us down. So you have to be flexible in science. Thank you.
So I'm hoping that one day you're going to return the favor. Maybe I come and ask you for money. But good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's actually my first time at UCI, which is really strange because I actually got my master's degree not too far from here in Los Angeles. But for some reason, I never drove down to Irvine. I've been a number of times to San Diego, but for some random reason, I'd always skipped Irvine. So it's nice to actually be here, interact with great people, and visit your beautiful campus. What I'd like to do this afternoon is give you a bit of a glimpse for some of the work that we've been doing for the past 2 years in the area of privacy and mobile and IoT also. And I will try to introduce the topic. I'd like to get perhaps a bit of a sense for how many of you are familiar with the notice and choice framework in privacy. Okay, so in truth, you are all familiar with it, and as soon as I'll describe it, I think it will become very clear that you are familiar with it and that you can relate to it fairly easily. So the notice and choice paradigm is effectively what we refer to when we're talking about fair information practices, and the idea that when it comes to the collection of use of your data, you as a data subject, as we typically say in this field, someone whose data is being collected and used for various purposes, you as a data subject should be given notice of what information is being collected, for what purpose, by whom, how long it's going to be retained, and all sorts of other things along those lines that may have an impact on whether or not you feel comfortable with that collection. And you should hopefully also be given some kind of meaningful choice. And how that takes place in practice might be in the form of opting in, opting out, different types of settings, and unfortunately more often than not, no settings. But the principle of notice and choice, or informed consent, is the idea that in principle, when we're going to be collecting information about you, you should be told about that fact. You should be told about what will be done with your information, and you should be given some meaningful option in terms of deciding whether or not you're willing to tag along. And I'm sure you can easily think of scenarios where that's not the case. Right? So clearly when you go through immigration, for instance, when you re-enter the country, you don't get to ask people to turn off the surveillance cameras. Right? That's just not an option. But that's the basic idea behind this concept. And so in particular, when you look at how we interact with, for instance, the web, right? Many websites have privacy policies, and these privacy policies are effectively presented to us as the way in which these sites deal with notice and choice. So they're conveying to you some information about presumably what information they're collecting, what they're going to be doing with that information, who they might be sharing it with, for how long they might be able to retain it, whether or not government has the right to request access to it, and all these other fun facts. And occasionally they might also give you some options. So for instance, in the financial industry, you might have seen those notices that you receive on a regular basis. This is a result of Graham Leach Bliley, and there are a number of situations where you might potentially be able to opt out of some sharing, for instance, of your information with marketers and the like. So let's sort of make this a bit more interactive. So how many of you have actually read a privacy policy over the past month? Wow, you guys are impressive. 2 people, 3 I think, I saw 3 hands. I've never seen more hands than this in my entire career, so this is a very impressive group. Obviously, there's probably another 50 people who are not raising their hands. So let me try to relax my question a little bit. So how many of you have read a privacy policy over the past 6 months? I'm getting a few more hands, yes, so roughly 7 or 8. So how about a fraction of a privacy policy over the past year? Okay, all right. So we're getting to almost half of the room. And so I think I've made my point. So clearly, this idea that somehow these privacy policies will help us make informed decisions is a bit of a gimmick, right? I've got colleagues who've actually done studies looking at how long and how much time we have to spend reading the privacy policies of all the websites that we access during the course of the year, and they've concluded that this would be a fairly meaningful percentage of the GDP, right? Like 15%. It takes about 10, 15, 20 minutes to read a privacy policy. And the fun fact about this is that, and I've done this quite a bit because I have a sister project I'm not going to talk about much today, where we're actually asking people to annotate privacy policies using crowdsourcing, machine learning, and NLP. And when you look at what happens when you ask people questions about the privacy policy that they've just read, many of them really struggle. Right? So even the fact that you're reading the privacy policy doesn't mean that you actually understood everything that you've read. And those courageous people in this room who actually read privacy policies might remember that a lot of the language that you get across is very ambiguous. And it's not necessarily intended to increase your level of information, that whole idea of informed consent. So for this reason and other reasons, people are concluding increasingly that this notice and choice concept, at least the way in which it exists today, the way in which it is implemented today, is rapidly failing. Just perhaps to illustrate this a bit further, how many of you have smartphones? Hoping to see everyone here, please. Yes, so everyone has a smartphone. So how many of you know what privacy settings you've got on your smartphone? You're truly, truly impressive. And I would love to find out what settings you have. I'm a privacy expert, and I have to admit I don't exactly know what my privacy settings are right now, even though I pay a lot of attention to them. But you ask this to a general audience, to regular lay people, and the vast majority of people. And what I mean by vast majority is probably 99% of the population has no idea what these settings are. Many people don't even know that there are privacy settings on their smartphones to control what information their apps can access. And so this obviously creates a problem. And obviously, if this is already a problem on the fixed web, then what are the chances that this approach is going to work with smartphones, right? So if you don't read privacy policies on the fixed web, on your large, 15-inch, 17-inch monitor when you're at home or at the office, what are the chances you're going to read this on a 4-inch screen, right? While on the move, walking, down the street, trying to do all sorts of different things. It's not going to happen. And then obviously, you can go one step further. And how about IoT, right? When you enter a room like this and you've got 20 different sensors, and services that are tracking various aspects of your activities, what are the chances that you're going to start to say, oops, before I open this door, I better read these 20 policies and look at whatever settings might be available for me? It's clearly not going to happen, right? And so that's a very major problem, because obviously, along with this trend, more and more data is being collected about us, right? So we're living in what people refer to as a data-centric economy, right? Every company out there is figuring ways of using big data and collecting more information about you to personalize their interactions with you, to know you better, to increase the chance that you're going to want to purchase their products and their services. And so what I'd like to do initially is I'd like to tell you a bit more about how this materializes in practice in the mobile space, and some of the work that we've done over the past few years to try to overcome this challenge and effectively try to make notice and choice a more practical concept in the context of smartphones. Having done that, I'll discuss a bit what we're doing in the IoT space, applying some of the very same principles. And as you're going to see, a lot of research that we've done revolves around the idea that perhaps we might be able to develop what we call personalized privacy assistance. So the idea is that rather than relying on people reading all these policies on their own, making decisions and configuring all these different settings on their own, perhaps we can rely on functionality that will learn enough about us over time so that a lot of these decisions can be made on our behalf, so that information can be filtered, and only the information that we care about, the information that perhaps we don't already know or don't already expect, is conveyed to you. And in an ideal world, I would like these personalized privacy assistants to follow me across all the different environments that I run across, leveraging correlations between my preferences when I use my browser, privacy preference when I use my browser, and privacy preference that I might have when I use my smartphone, and privacy preference I might have when I use my smart car, and my Facebook account, and all these other environments where you have a number of different decisions that you have to make. I would like this privacy assistant to perhaps only interact with me 3 or 4 times during the course of the day, very selectively inform me about a few things that are really of interest, that would really surprise me, that might lead me to changing my behavior or configure some settings in a particular way, checking with me that it has a decent understanding of my preferences so that it can actually configure many settings on my behalf. And the rest of the time, I would like to not even know that this thing exists. That's roughly the vision. That's roughly what we're trying to pursue. And so the question is, well, that sounds beautiful, right? But can you actually make that happen? And so we've actually made a decent amount of progress in this space. And I'll try to walk you through a series of studies and technologies that we've developed over the past few years and try to show you where we are in terms of trying to support that vision. So that's the plan for this afternoon. And so as we all realize, and I've already talked about this a couple of times now, smartphones are the perfect environment in many ways to study this problem. So if you look at mobile apps on your smartphone, and we could do a show of hands on that too, but I'll sort of quickly cut through the chase here. So most people these days have somewhere, if you've got an Android phone, you've got somewhere between 50 and 100 apps on your smartphone. If you've got an iOS phone, you've got slightly fewer apps because there are fewer pre-installed apps on your cell phone. Number of permissions, conservatively, each app requires about 3 permissions. I heard from someone, there's a Pew study that just came out earlier this week that says 5, so 5 might be, it doesn't matter, honestly. You do the math, whichever way you cut it, even if it's 50 apps and 3 permissions, that's 150 decisions that you've got to make. Nobody's going to make this many decisions, right? And so that's a perfect environment, and the trend, as you probably realize, has been for this number of decisions to go up. Why? Because the way in which iOS and Android have been competing is by trying to offer more and more content to users, and the way in which you offer more and more content is by exposing more and more APIs, right? And as you develop more and more APIs, including APIs that are going to be collecting a lot of sensitive information, accessing sensitive functionality, you're going to effectively give rise to an increasingly broad range of scenarios that have privacy implications, and therefore you're going to potentially want to expose settings to users so that they can, to some extent, control these data flows. How well do they do that so far? We'll discuss this also this afternoon. And so in particular, one of the problems that we've had in this space is that many apps obviously cost nothing, at least on the surface, right? And the reason why they cost nothing is that many app developers make money through advertising. And as a result, many of these apps also collect a bit more information than they would really need to if it was only to support their own core functionality. And so this is why when you look at Pandora, it collects your location and gender and year of birth, and Path collects your entire contacts list. When we wrote this slide, it was without user consent. I think that has changed now. Brightest flashlight was a fun one that the FTC went after reading a report. So in case you don't know what brightest flashlight is, how many of you don't know what brightest flashlight is? Okay, so I'm sure you can guess what it is though. So effectively it just turns on all the lights on your phone, right? It turns it into a flashlight. And as you can easily imagine, it doesn't require collecting your internet. It doesn't require internet access. It doesn't require your location. Turning the light on is turning the light on. It doesn't matter where you are. The Bible accesses your location, and there are many other examples along those lines. And you might say, okay, so what? That's the world that we live in, right? And I like to have all my free apps. And so perhaps, it doesn't matter. But in fact, when you ask people, and I'm sort of quickly going through some of the early studies we did in this space, when you ask people and you tell them about these practices, and you ask them how they feel, most of them are very surprised. So for instance, most people are very surprised to hear that Angry Bird requires their location. And we did studies where we tell them, look, Angry Bird requires location. They would then say, well, in that case, maybe I'm going to get rid of Angry Bird. But it's not a decision that everyone would make. A lot of people love their Angry Bird, and they'll continue to use Angry Bird even if it requires their location. And so not everybody feels the same way, as you can already tell based on this chart here. So Facebook requiring a location, most people expect that. They've noticed that you have check-in functionality. Facebook requiring your contacts list, most people are surprised and not terribly comfortable with that. Brightest flashlight in this part of the study, this was an early study where we looked at the 100 most popular apps in Android back then, 95% of people were very surprised and partly upset to hear that it requires their location as well as their unique device ID, which is effectively a super cookie if you think about it. And so we, in our early studies, we obviously publicized this quite a bit, and also played a bit the role of advocates, going to getting a lot of visibility for this research, talking to companies like Google and Apple. In the early days, iOS was really only giving you control over your location. As you've probably noticed, if you've got an iOS phone, the number of settings that are available these days has increased. It seems that every new version of iOS that gets released, more and more settings get exposed to users, and that's obviously very good, but that also means that you get to this explosion of settings. The 100 or 150, whichever way we want to do the math these days, is clearly well beyond what you can reasonably expect a user to configure. So are these settings good or bad? As I said, well, I think they're good, right? It's good that finally industry has responded in some manner, and for those of you who are not following very closely what is happening right now, Android, which for a long time had no settings, right? So the way Android users would have to deal with those permissions is that at the time they would download the app, there would be a screen that would pop up and say, and by the way, this app that you really want to download pretty badly right now requires the following permissions. Continue to download or cancel, right? How many of you have canceled when they reach that point, right? Wow, this is tremendous. You're truly unique. In truth, hardly anybody does this, right? So, and behavioral psychologists will tell you that this is, the worst possible time to ask this question to users, because at that particular point in time, what matters most to users, so people are very disciplined, but what matters most to users at that particular point in time is to have that app on their phone so that they can start playing with it, right? And so this is this situation where you tend to favor the short-term reward so much more, and you discount very heavily long-term risks, right? So the long-term privacy risk appear really very vague and abstract at that point in time, but being able to play with that app that you read about, that your friends told you about, that's all that matters, right? So most people would ignore that. So as of the latest version of Android 6, there are actually now settings that are very similar to those that you have in iOS. So effectively both ecosystems over the past few years have recognized that privacy was an issue, and they were not going to get away with the way they were handling that earlier, and they've exposed all these settings now to users. And the question is, are users really engaged with these settings? And the results there are fairly mixed, and I'll show you some examples of studies that we've done in that space in a few minutes. So by and large, this is good, but it's really also very impractical, and I'll illustrate that a little bit more. So we've tried to ask ourselves to what extent perhaps we could build models of people's privacy preferences when it comes to configuring these settings, and effectively reconcile what is a fundamental tension between privacy and usability. Right? The number of settings is great, right? In principle, on paper, you have full control, right? So I could say, we really care about, if I'm Apple, I would say, we really care about the privacy of our users. Look at all these settings we made available to them just over the past few years. What else could they be asking for? But in truth, if the number of settings that you make available to users is unmanageable, if the number of settings that you make available to users is not aligned with the privacy preferences that people have, which is another issue I'll show you in a few minutes, then you may not have accomplished very much. And so first question to ask is, to what extent could I potentially learn people's privacy preferences, build models of how they feel about these settings? To what extent are there correlations between where you feel about one of those settings and a bunch of others? And if so, could I potentially reduce the number of questions I ask you, potentially down to a small number of questions, and then configure a bunch of these settings, effectively reducing user burden and maximizing privacy at the same time? And so to answer these questions, we conducted several studies, and this is what I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about. One of the first studies that we conducted was aimed at getting a better sense for the information collected by many of these apps. So this was about 3 years ago now. We scanned about 90,000 apps. They're actually tools that enable you to fairly easily decompile these apps and actually look at the code. This is static analysis, as it's called. You can look at the code of these apps, right? And then you can look for effectively calls to APIs, sensitive APIs like location, contacts list, and you can see where these calls fit within the code. And so what you often find is that those calls are actually part of places in the code where information is being sent to a particular URL, a third-party website or a third-party provider. And based on that particular third-party provider, there's actually a fairly limited number of players. It's in the orders of 500 to 1,000. You can actually tell what happens to that information. So you've got advertising networks, you've got social networks, you've got data brokers and the like. They're fairly easy to recognize. It's not like you've got a huge number of them. And so we did this study. We studied this initially with about, like I said, about 90,000 apps. We're fairly successful on the whole. We're able to decompile about 85%. And we started looking at these third-party libraries that API calls where you had API calls to sensitive permissions and the information was being directly sent to these various URIs. We quickly recognized that within this space you could come up with about 9 categories of third-party libraries, and a few of those in particular were of interest to us. So the targeted ads or the advertising networks, the social networking sites, and the mobile analytics companies or data brokers, if you want, the companies that build fairly extensive profiles about you. And to cut a long story short, just to give you a sense for the extent of those practices and the extent to which applications are collecting information that they don't themselves need, I thought I would illustrate this in particular with this chart here. So in this chart, every line represents a sensitive permission, like internet access, location, phone state, read contacts. And the columns here represent the purpose for which this information is being accessed. So internal use means that the app actually really needs this and it's going to be using it, just like the navigation app needs your location to give you directions. But targeted ads obviously deals with collecting that same information to send you more targeted ads. Mobile analytics deals with data brokers, and SNS deals with social networking sites. And so in particular, I'd like to bring to your attention location. So this chart here, this is based on these 90,000 apps that I was talking about. I think these numbers have remained very stable over the past 3 years. This chart here shows you that when it comes to an app collecting your location, about 17% of the time that app collects your location because it really needs it. About 72.94% of the time when an app requests your location, it's for advertising purposes. It's not for itself, it's to share with an advertising network. About 26% of the time is to share with a mobile analytics company. About 6% of the time is to share with a social networking site. Yes, go ahead.
Is this based on the flow analysis that you're talking about, or based
on? So this is based on static analysis.
Static analysis.
So this is based on the presence of these calls to the APIs, like the location API in Android, and sending that information. So this is not based on dynamic analysis. This is not based. I'll talk a bit more about actual flow. This is just based on static analysis. But the number of calls, if you want, that's the stat that I'm talking about here. Right. So this gives you a sense. So this is also another way of looking at this, organized by different categories of apps. And as you can tell here, we've organized this by targeted apps, mobile analytics, social networking sites. And you can tell that obviously many of the free apps, games, cards, casinos, and those sorts of things, rely very heavily on targeted ads. That's their business model. When you get more to utility apps, for instance, there's a lot less of that taking place. Many more of these apps have actually different business models. So just wanted to mention this as a side note so that you have a bit more of a context in terms of the magnitude of these practices. What we were really interested in is to answer that earlier questions that I've mentioned, namely to what extent we can potentially learn people's privacy preferences when it comes to willingness to disclose this data to different types of providers, advertising networks, profiling companies, and obviously using that information for internal purposes within different apps. So a first study that we conducted in this space involved 725 smartphone users, looking at 837 mobile apps, so fairly small numbers, and effectively collecting about 20,000 answers to questions such as, how comfortable are you giving access to this particular app, right, for this particular permission, for this particular purpose, right? So something like, how comfortable are you giving access to Angry Bird to your location for advertising purposes? So we collected about 20,000 of those answers. The demographics were not perfect, slightly skewed in terms of age group and gender, but still reasonable to reach some conclusions. And the sorts of results that you get when you do that look like this. So what you're looking at here is along the horizontal axis, you're looking at 4 different types of purposes. Internal means that the information being collected is collected for the app itself to be able to operate. Ads refer to advertising networks. Analytics is just another term for data brokers and profiling companies. And SNS stands for social networking sites. Along the vertical axis here, I've just listed 6 permissions, sensitive permissions. So find location, so this is GPS level of granularity resolution. Course location, which tends to be more block size and beyond. Phone state, which includes all the different people that have called you or that you've called, whether or not you've got an incoming call. Contacts list, these are all the people in your contacts list. SMS, this is texting functionality, and accounts, like the accounts where you might be storing, for instance, financial data. And the first thing I want to point out, I should also explain the colors. So the scale here ranges from -2 to +2. -2 means least comfortable, and +2 means most comfortable. And the darker shades of red correspond to effectively lack of comfort, and the lighter shades of red correspond to users on the overall being fairly comfortable. So the first thing I want to point out is that the shades of colors that you have here are clearly very different based on the type of purpose that you're looking at. So purpose clearly matters. And purpose is an example of something that right now neither iOS nor Android gives you control over. But it's certainly something that we would strongly advocate for becoming available, because that's ultimately an indication that right now the settings are not aligned with the preferences that people really have. But more importantly, to go back to the center, the key topic of this presentation here, more importantly, what you notice is that there are clearly differences in shades between these different boxes, even for given purposes. And so you might say, well, perhaps we can reach some conclusions. So certainly based on this array here, you would say that people feel least comfortable sharing their contacts list, right, with advertising networks. That's the -0.97 on a scale of -2 to +2. That's pretty negative. And so you might say, oh, perhaps we can start configuring permission settings just based on this information. And so one of the first things that we looked into, and this is very consistent with research we've conducted in other domains, is we looked at the variance in this data. And when you look at the variance in this data, you quickly realize that not all people feel the same way. In fact, if you look at that contacts list being shared with advertisers, notice that this is actually the place where my variance is the largest. I've got a 2.3 here. And so what that means is that even though on average people feel very uncomfortable sharing their contacts list with advertisers, there are clearly some people who don't care, right? And so not everybody feels the same way. It's not one size fits all. And so the next question is obviously, okay, if it's not one size fits all, notice that this is true for most of the boxes here, right? So effectively I'm looking at variance that ranges from roughly 1 to about 2.3. So relatively large numbers, given that we're on a scale of -2 to +2. But the hope, and this is what we looked into very quickly, the hope was that somehow we could organize what seems to be a very diverse set of preferences into a small number of clusters of like-minded users. And so when you mine this data and you apply, for instance, hierarchical clustering and other techniques, as it turns out, very quickly you can come up with a fairly small number of clusters that will do a fairly decent job at collectively capturing the preferences of your overall population. So in this case here, and we'll show you what these profiles look like. In this case, just with 4 profiles, I will show you that I can actually capture the preferences of my population of users with about 80% accuracy, which is pretty impressive. And so what are those profiles? What do they look like? Well, we've actually been able to label these profiles in this particular case because they're fairly obvious. So the first profile here, which amounts to about 22% of the users in this population, are people that by and large feel comfortable with pretty much anything. So notice that their numbers are actually mostly positive, right? Actually, all of them are positive, right? So on a scale of -2 to +2, many of these readings are very close to 1, and most of them are at least above 0. Even contacts list, right, which is the one that seems to be the most sensitive, these people are at a 0.02, right? And when you look at the variance, by the way, notice how much my variance has dropped. So this is a very homogeneous group of people. Variance numbers are basically around 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. Much, much smaller than what we had earlier. So this is clearly a group that we've labeled the so-called unconcerned cluster. These people are willing to pretty much go with anything. Another group that we had, this was our largest group, we called them the Fencesitters because they were a bit more complex, and they're actually worth breaking down. Many other studies that we've conducted, we've actually broken this down a bit more. This other group has more nuanced types of preferences. As you notice here, there's actually still a lot of positive numbers, but you're starting to get a few negative numbers. So sharing find location with advertisers, that's a minus 0.33. Sharing contacts list with advertisers, that's a minus 0.22. So again, these people here are still feeling fairly comfortable on the whole, but they're a bit more sophisticated. They realize how sensitive their find location is, and they definitely realize how sensitive their contacts information is. And again, if you look at variance here, fairly small numbers, not quite as small as the others, but you've got 0.2, 0.3, 0.6 is about as high as it gets. Another group, which would obviously be expected, is the conservatives. Right? So those are people who are pretty much like no to everything. And so those amounted to about 12% of our population. So when it comes to sharing their contacts list with advertisers, that's a minus 1.91. On a scale of minus 2 to plus 2, that's a fairly clear message about how they feel. Right? Find location with advertiser, minus 1.33. These people are very clearly not comfortable sharing very much. Look again at the variance here, very, very small numbers. So we clearly again have a very homogeneous group of people. And then we have what we call the advanced users, and that was about 18% of our population. And here, notice actually that those guys are pretty sophisticated too. So clearly when it comes to find location, contacts, they're also very negative. In fact, contacts, they're at the extreme of the spectrum. Nobody in that group was willing to share their contacts with advertisers. But these are people who recognize the value of sharing their find location, for instance, with apps for internal purposes. So even find location is a 1.02. And again, if you look at variance here, very, very low numbers. So effectively, these are four fairly homogeneous groups of people. And the question is, how predictive are these groups? So how predictive is effectively membership in one of these groups? So we built some decision trees based on these clusters, and looked at what it would take and how well we would do if we were to start making predictions about the settings that these people will want to have, right, based on their membership in one of these groups. So effectively, the decision tree involved asking just a small number of questions, and these are the kinds of results that you get. Right. So if you take, for instance, the first chart that I showed you, where I sort of grouped the entire population in one cluster, effectively what I call grand averages. If you were to actually configure people's settings just based on these average settings that we looked at, you'd get about 55% accuracy. That means that nearly half the time your settings would be wrong for these people. If you use the four profiles corresponding to four clusters that I identified, you're actually going to do very well with some of these groups. Like the conservatives, you're going to get it right 86% of the time. Unconcerned, 85% of the time. On average, you're getting to about 80% accuracy for this population. And this is with very, very simple clusters, just four clusters. Right? We also looked at user burden. That means that if instead of trying to necessarily configure all these decisions automatically, I were to ask users when I'm not sure about how they feel about these permissions, and I would just configure automatically those decisions where I am pretty sure, I would get effectively a reduction in user burden of about 64%. Well, if I rely on grand averages, I only get a reduction of about 14%. Right, so this looked fairly promising, still very naive in its approach. Yes, go ahead.
What were the four features you used for this tree? What were the questions you asked?
So in this case, I actually don't remember, but I'll get to more interesting questions. I'll actually show you. So I'm sort of going progressively. I'm going to get to a point where we actually deploy this with real users, and I'll show you the question that we're asking. I also have a demo if we have the time, although that demo may be a bit difficult. I can actually project the demo potentially. We'll see if we have time or not. But those are very simple questions. What we've done, for instance, live, typically involves asking between 3 and 5 questions to users, and then figuring which cluster they belong to. The app that we have actually in the Android Google Play Store now asks between 3 and 5 questions, and we'll make a bunch of recommendations to you about what settings you might want to adopt. So we're actually making good progress, but I'm really getting ahead of myself here. So we were able, at some point we were lucky enough that we were given access to a fairly substantial data set from a company called LBE. This is a company that has been running its own version of Android now for a number of years. And they actually gave us access to the permissions of about, I think it was 4 million users. We looked at these permissions, and this is an environment where you have 12 different permissions, effectively. You can manipulate SMS, phone call, phone state, contacts list positioning, so very similar types of permissions. We looked at this very large corpus and decided that to do anything meaningful with it, we should get rid of all those users who were not terribly engaged with the permissions. And so we came up with a number of conditions to sort of only focus on those users who had made a number of changes to their permissions, and came to a number of about 240,000 users. So still fairly meaningful corpus, about 12,000 apps, about 14.5 million records. And these records basically amounted to selecting between 3 different options for each permission. Either deny, grant access, or request to be prompted every time. And the distribution of the apps, just in case you're curious, so the distribution of the apps, most of the time, so each dot here represents a different app. And so it gives you a sense for the mix between users who had selected deny, allow, or ask. As you can tell, people don't like to be prompted all the time, so they tend to converge with either deny or allow, but very often you find that there's a mix, reflecting again the diversity of preferences that people have, right? And so within that context, we build a bunch of clusters, but the reason why I'm showing you this data is actually to show you how much further you can go than just building clusters. So in this case, what we did with this data, and this was simulated, this was based on real data, but simulations. We didn't have access to the users back then. But we wanted to see how we could potentially build also models for each individual user, looking effectively at 20% of the apps and the settings that they had selected for these apps, and on that basis, deciding how to configure the settings for the remaining 80% of the apps that they had. And what we were able to show, based on the number of questions that we're asking users in this simulation, this is a simulation, we're able to show that with just 6 questions, we were able to get to about 90% accuracy. So this is a model where either you feel very comfortable that you understand how the user feels about that permission, and then you set it automatically, or you realize that your level of certainty is below given threshold, and you just assume that you're asking the user. Obviously, we didn't have the real user, this was simulated, and we assumed that the user would answer perfectly, right? But when you ask 20% of the time questions, if you're willing to do that, then you're getting to about 94% accuracy. So you compare that, and again, like I said, this audience here is not representative of the general population. Most people are not engaged with their permissions. And so if you compare this with a very large number of users who've got no idea what their permissions are, do not have the time and courage to engage with these permissions, it should be pretty obvious that 92% or 94% is well beyond the level of accuracy that a regular user has on his or her cell phone today when it comes to these permissions. So we view this as being very positive. We also played with clusters again, and were very successful, even just with 3 clusters. We played actually with a number of different clusters. So let me sort of summarize where we are, because I'd like to get beyond these. So these were sort of the early results that we had in this space. So effectively, through these early experiments, we're able to show that, number one, people care about their privacy. That was very clear. People have diverse privacy preferences, so one size fits all doesn't work. Number 3, we also showed that even though these preferences are fairly diverse, even with a very small number of profiles or clusters, you can actually go a fairly long way in probably configuring many settings on behalf of these users. I showed you 80% accuracy just with 4 profiles. What we still don't know at this stage in the presentation is to what extent we can motivate users to engage with this functionality. If you're going to ask them questions, how do you prevent them from just ignoring you, just like they're ignoring the existing settings on their phones? How do you get meaningful preferences from users? So this is something that I've completely glossed over so far. I've sort of pretended that somehow these privacy preferences really exist. And if I take a random person in the street, I can just ask them, how do you feel about sharing your location with Angry Bird? And I'm going to get the ultimate answer, and this person is never going to change their mind. A lot of work in privacy has shown that these preferences are very difficult to elicit. And depending on how you frame the questions, you're going to get very different answers. Right? So the typical example that a lot of people would point to, and people have concluded even from that privacy was dead, is they said, by and large, you ask people, do you care about your privacy, right? And they will, the vast majority of people will say, sure, I care about privacy. And then you say, how about giving me all this information in exchange for a $2 coupon on a sandwich? And by and large, everybody gives you their information too, within minutes potentially. I mean, those experiments have been run. And so people are left wondering, well, which one of these 2 answers is the correct one? right? And so it's really about how do you frame these questions properly to get answers that are stable enough, that really reflect how people feel, right? The problem with these questions, the way I introduce them right now to you, like asking whether or not you care about privacy, is that it's a very abstract question. It's not being asked in a context that is terribly, terribly meaningful, and so you're going to give me back a very abstract answer, right? And depending on how you word the questions, as I said, you're going to effectively get different answers. And ultimately, how do people really behave in the wild when you start potentially configuring settings on their behalf, right? And so we've run a few studies since then to answer these questions. And the first question that we wanted to answer is, how do we motivate people to even pay attention to their settings? And so is it the case that it's just an issue of motivation, and that if we were to properly motivate people, they would be able to make effective use of all these permissions that are currently available on their phone, or do we need to go beyond that, right? And so a first study that we conducted in this space involved looking at the effectiveness of what we refer to as permission managers. So these are effectively the interface that you have in iOS or Android these days to configure your permissions. So how effective are these permission managers? And could we somehow further motivate users, perhaps through what we call nudges or different messages that you would very selectively send to them that would increase their level of awareness of what's going on and perhaps further motivate them. And we had seen already some of that in the studies we had conducted, where you would tell people, Angry Bird collects your location, or Brightest Flashlight collects your location. When we survey these people, a number of them actually would go and actually remove some of these apps. So it's clear that this additional knowledge, better awareness by itself, can actually make a difference. And so we wanted to evaluate this. And so one of the studies we conducted in this space was a 22-day study with 23 participants, Android users. And in this study, we observed them for about a week just to look at the behavior of the apps that they had on their cell phones and collect information about the frequency at which the different permissions that these apps were requesting, the frequency at which these permissions were being accessed. In the second week, we told them, here is an interface. In this case, this was called AppUps, for those of you who work with Android. This was an interface very similar to the interface you have in iOS, and the interface that has been introduced now in Android 6. So this is an interface where, on an app-by-app basis, you can toggle permissions on and off. And then in the final 8 days of the study, we started sending these people one message per day. And that message had to do with one of a set of 4 sensitive permissions that we decided to focus on: location, texting, call logs, and I think the fourth one was, calendar. But we'll see when we get to the right slide. And so we wanted to see how people's behavior changed during the course of this study. So this is an example of a real nudge that we sent to these people. These were real people, real Android users who were using their phones. These were regular Android phones that were not rooted. This was actually a unique time window that we had about a year and a half ago, when Android had this version of AppUps, which is a permission manager, that had been left there by accident by Google. And we're able to use it for about a period of a few months. And so we're really dealing with regular Android users with their regular apps, interacting with this functionality through their regular lives, their regular activities. And so this is an example of a nudge, which became the title of a paper. This is a paper we published at CAI last year. So did you know that your location has been shared 5,398 times with Facebook, Groupon, and 7 other apps over the past 14 days? So people respond very well to these kinds of nudges. I can tell you, I will show you some stats in a minute. Most people have no idea about the frequency at which some of this information is being collected, how much information is being collected by their apps. That number, by the way, 5,398, was actually, when we spent more time, we made a mistake of coming up with a title for a paper before finishing the analysis of our data. And when we, after submitting the title, we realized that 5,398 was actually a low number over 2 weeks, and that a number of users were actually above 6,000. But anyway, the title stuck. And so once they had these nudges, they had the ability to then go to their permission manager and look also at the frequency at which individual apps had been collecting their information, in this case the location, and they had the option of toggling things on and off. Okay, so what happened in this study? Like I said, we collected about 23 users. This was done in the wild, and lots of different stats about these users. I don't want to completely bore you, but roughly a fairly meaningful group of people, somewhat representative of the general Android population, as best as I can tell. Let me start with a chart that's impossible to read, but I'll explain it to you for a minute. This is sort of the quick summary of what happened. So if you recall, this is a 22-day study. The first two, we also call it a 3-week study, with the first 2 weeks being 7 days in length and the last week being 8 days in length. And the reason why the last week was 8 days in length is because we're dealing with 4 different permissions, and we wanted to send 2 nudges on 2 different days for each of the 4 permissions. And so we needed to create an 8-day week. So the first week was uninteresting. We're just using it to create a baseline and collect information from all these apps, seeing how often they were accessing information. The second week, we told these users, hey, here's a permission manager. Most people had no idea that AppOps was actually available. In fact, 21 out of the 23 users had never heard about AppOps, and one of the 23 users had used AppOps, but for a very short period of time. So these people were untainted, if you want. So during the second week, we told them, here's a permission manager. This is what it enables you to do. And go review your privacy settings and see if you want to modify them. And by and large, the color that you want to look at is this royal blue color here. That's an indication that a user went and edited his settings, effectively restricted access to a given permission. The vertical axis here, each row, so each vertical line is a different day. So we're starting at day 8 and going on through day 22. And each line here is representing a different participant in the study. I'll explain a bit later the different ways of grouping these users. So what you want to see is that the permission manager actually had an impact on people's behavior. Once they were told that they had the ability to modify their settings, a number of them actually did engage with this functionality and made some modifications. So those are the royal blue dots that you're seeing here. This is the beginning of week 3. This is where every day we'd send them a single nudge. Right? And a nudge would be a nudge like the one I showed you. Did you know that your location has been shared 398 times? Or did you know that, for instance, texting functionality has been accessed this many times? And so now the dots are becoming more colorful and there's a bit more going on. But what you want to look at, again, is a combination of effectively a couple of different colors, but maybe even beyond the colors. You just want to look at the number of little dots that you have. That number of dots should convey to you that there's a lot more activity taking place within that third week. So these nudges have a very significant impact on, number one, awareness and also motivation. Users saying, my goodness, what's going on here? What's also very important to know is that these were the same users who had the permission manager the previous week. So these guys already had access to this permission manager for an entire week, right? They had already a chance to modify their settings, but all of a sudden when you start nudging them, they realize that they're not happy with the settings that they had configured. Notice also that the previous week, week 2, a lot of activity at the beginning, but not so much later on. So these users had decided somehow, either they had forgotten about the functionality, or they had decided they were pretty happy with their preferences. And through interviews, we clarified that most of them remember they had the functionality, but they decided by and large they had configured things the way that they felt comfortable with, and they didn't see a need to make more changes. So the nudges clearly changed that. The nudges increased their level of awareness. Yes, go ahead.
What does nudge ignored mean?
So here, okay, so I should explain a bit more detail what's going on. So a nudge being ignored means that the user gets the nudge and the user says, get rid of this nudge, I don't want to do anything. And so we're seeing some of those. You're seeing more of those actually during the second part of the third week, because people receive that nudge for the second time, and at that point they feel that, hey, I've already responded to this and I'm actually comfortable with the change I made earlier. But here you've got also nudge kept sharing, so people said, okay, let me check my settings. So they're still checking their settings after receiving the nudge, but they decided they're actually happy with those settings. And obviously here, what you're seeing is in these two colors, you're seeing people opening their interface and actually making restrictive changes. Right. So let me go a bit deeper into this. Right. So what this should show you, if you were to, so the stats at a more detailed level show that in the second phase, when they just had a permission manager, the participants reviewed their app permissions 51 times. So this is 22 participants 51 times. They restricted 76 distinct apps and a total of 272 permissions. Right? If you keep in mind that this is 23 different people, that's over 10 permissions per user, just based on the availability of this permission manager. we showed these results, by the way, to Google, and they told us that one major reason why they introduced the permission manager that you have now in Android 6 was as a result of this study. So they actually sent us a letter that they said, this is for you to show to your dean, but you got to keep it private, or at least we're not going to have a press release about it. It's okay for you to mention it, which is what I'm doing. So it's okay to brag about it, but no press release. But this actually motivated them to say, okay, well, clearly we've got to catch up with iOS, because iOS was clearly doing that. We're actually surprised by these results. I was actually a lot more negative before running this study. I thought that there would be a lot less engagement about permissions. I thought that just the number of permissions is such that it's overwhelming and users are not going to engage. So this makes a difference, as it turns out. So this is all good. And I have many more stats on this, but I don't want to completely bore you. So I'm going to jump over a couple of things and get to week 3. Right? So the final 8 days. So what happens during the final 8 days? Right? So again, keep in mind that these users already had this permission manager. Right? And nevertheless, once you start nudging them, they reviewed another 69 times their permissions, and they further restricted 47 different apps for a total of 122 permissions. The numbers are a bit less than in the second week, but this is because they had already made a bunch of changes that they wanted. They're very significant numbers, right? And in fact, a very large percentage of these participants effectively realized that what they had done with Permission Manager didn't fully capture their preferences and went ahead and further modified their settings. Yes, go ahead.
Were they paid for participating in the
So
study?
we paid them to participate in the study, but we didn't pay them to modify their settings. So they were welcome to not change anything they wanted to, and some of them didn't change anything. In fact, those groups here that I didn't discuss sort of show you. So there was a group of 3 people who, by and large, ignored everything, never made a single change. There was a small group here that only made changes when it came to the second week, but never responded to nudges. But the point, however, is that if you look at the next 2 groups, there was a group that never did anything when they were given the permission manager, and only started restricting their permissions when they were given the nudges. And there was a group, the larger group, about half the participants, that actually benefited both from the permission manager and from the nudges. So those are the kinds of things that we do. There's a lot more to be said about this. One thing that we found, for instance, is that the permissions that people were modifying, even in the 3rd week, were not just the permissions for which we were sending them nudges. They were actually changing other permissions too. And that has to do with the fact that the interface we gave users were basically showing all the permissions requested by an app. And so you nudge them about location, and they go to this app, and they decide that I want to turn off location, but they say, and how about this camera? And they actually, so you've got actually speed up effects if you want, and people modify a number of additional permissions, as you can tell here. So we're actually very successful in terms of using this. I'm going to skip a few more slides. We interviewed people extensively, and they all confirmed that these nudges had a very major impact on increasing the level of awareness and motivating them to make changes. And so I'm going to sort of skip more slides. As you can tell here, I was very ambitious in preparing this, and I'm going to sort of move on to the last study that I want to cover, where we sort of started putting all these different pieces together. So as you can tell here, I'm skipping quite a few slides. So having done that, we then ask ourselves, went back to this question of, how do I know what a user's actual privacy preference is, right? Because that's, after all, what I want to learn, and that's, after all, what I would like to use as a basis for then configuring many settings on behalf of my users. And so we thought about this carefully, and we concluded that probably the preferences that you want to learn are preferences that will minimize regret. That means that if you let brightest flashlight, for instance, access your location, right? And after 2 months, you're told that brightest flashlight was collecting your location, and you say, "Oh my goodness, let me get rid of this app." That's regret. Clearly, that's above a certain threshold, and you feel that you really wish this had not happened. And so those are the kinds of preferences that we're interested in collecting. We're interested in effectively configuring your settings so that you don't experience regret later on. So how do we collect that, right? So how do you collect that? Asking someone just a question in abstract doesn't cut it. You really have to try and create that situation. And so the way we decided to create profiles so this was decided about a year ago, is we said, well, the way in which we're going to try to collect preferences and mine them to create these profiles is we're going to actually get real users and nudge them during the course of their daily activities and see to what extent they want to modify their settings. Once you've nudged them about actual apps that they've got on their actual phones and that where they've modified settings based on or in response to these nudges. And so what we did in this last study is we actually ran a combination of two studies. In the first study, we had 84 users that we observed for a period of several weeks. We submitted them to nudges, and we observed how they modified their settings. And then we used the resulting settings to build profiles. And we then built a first version of a personalized privacy assistant that effectively recommended modifications to settings of users. And we ran a second study with that personalized privacy assistant, where we're using these recommendations based on the profiles and observed how people responded to recommendations that we made. And then finally, this is a bit complicated, finally we wanted to see whether people were just nice to us and whether they were just following our recommendations because they wanted to, make us happy, which is very common in user studies. People like to make the experimenters happy. And so we decided that to make sure they would not modify their settings or that these were truly the preferences they felt comfortable with, we submitted them to another week of nudging and to try and see to what extent they would not potentially want to modify their settings further. And all that together is what I want to present over the next couple of minutes, and then I'll wrap up. So very quickly, so the methodology, as I said, is a methodology where we decide to use nudging to elicit people's privacy preferences and build profiles. And you might say, how crazy are you to think that somehow you can actually build profiles just based on 84 users? Right? And so we went back to some of earlier studies and looked at what happens when you do some down sampling. And we looked at, for instance, results that we had from a previous study where we had 700 and some users, and we played with number of clusters and number of size of the sample. What you're seeing here is number of clusters, and what you should see is that as soon as you're above 4 clusters or so, you can actually get very decent results with just a sample of 80 to 100 users. And so, because these studies are actually very difficult to run, especially for a university, we're not Google, so we don't have access to millions of users, we sort of came to the conclusion that 84 seemed to be a reasonable user. 84 obviously is the number we're able to collect. We're aiming for about between 80 and 100, and we ended up being able to keep 84 users for the entire duration of the study. These studies are not easy to run, I can tell you that much. And so based on these studies, the first study, we're able to build a bunch of profiles. This is what these profiles look like. So we ended up with 7 clusters in this particular case. The clusters are basically looking at 6 different permissions and a bunch of different app categories. So this is about different users feeling differently about whether or not to grant permissions to different categories of apps. We also looked at the purpose for which these permissions were being requested. And what you should see here is that there's a spectrum of colors that range from allow to deny, and you can tell that, for instance, some of these profiles are very permissive, while others obviously are very conservative in willingness to share information with different apps. The second step, as I said, was building these profiles to then we recruited a new set of users. These users had nothing to do with the first set of users, an entirely different set of users, and we got them to install an app that we call a personalized privacy assistant. And this personalized privacy assistant will look at the actual apps that these users had on their cell phone and dynamically build a decision tree to effectively figure which profile was the best match for these users based on the apps that they had on their cell phones. And so when we did that, right, we would effectively ask them questions like the one that we have here. So for instance, here we're listing 6 different apps that this user has on his cell phone. These travel and local apps, access to location 102 times over the past 2 days. In general, are you okay with travel and local apps accessing the location, yes or no? And so people would typically answer between 3 and 5 questions before we had determined which profile they were in. And after having gone through that, we'd be able to come up with recommendations of this form. So in this case here, we're effectively recommending a bunch of different permission modifications in one shot. Right? How far you can go in offering all these suggestions at once, this is still a subject of further research, but we were actually very successful, and certainly this number of permissions people felt very comfortable with. We identified that through interviews with them, and also, as I said, by subjecting them to more nudging over a period of another 6 days. So here people have the ability to then manipulate some of our recommendations. So they don't necessarily have to accept everything. They could say, well, I'm agreeing with this and that, but not necessarily those two, right? And then they can click and get these permissions to be modified accordingly. So I'm going to cut this very short again, but the results are as follows. So when we ran this with a little over 20 users, we found that about 73.7% of the recommendations that we made were actually accepted by users. But the most significant result is the following. We noticed that even after nudging these users for another 6 days, every day, showing them things that perhaps they didn't know, they only went back on 5.6% of the recommendations they had accepted. Now you might say, okay, perhaps they were asleep. Maybe they decided not to pay attention to your nudges anymore. And so what we also found is that because our nudges also included permissions for which we had not made recommendations, for those other permissions, the users were actually extremely engaged and were making a bunch of different changes. So that idea that somehow they were not engaged doesn't seem to hold. It's really that those recommendations were good, and you could not get people to really move away from these recommendations. And so we view these results as being very positive. We don't think that we've solved this problem, but this is based on real users with real cell phones, their actual apps, right, running this in the wild, and we view this as being very promising. So there's a lot more work to be done in this space, and in fact, we're also now looking at what it takes to effectively apply this in an IoT context. And here, things are obviously even more complex. It's something that we're collaborating here with our colleagues from UCI, Sharad, Alfred, and others. And clearly, the scenarios that we're looking at are more complex than just having people looking at apps on their cell phones. We're looking at what happens when you enter in a room like this, right? What should I tell you? And what is it that you don't care to know about? So extending your profiles, not just to preferences that you have about what you feel comfortable with and what you don't, but also preferences that you might have or about what you care to be told and what you don't care to be told, because either you're already assuming it or it just doesn't matter to you. And so our vision in this space is one where as you move into different buildings, different rooms, there will be various applications that will be broadcasting a machine-readable version of their privacy policies. Your personalized privacy assistant will compare your preferences against these policies, will potentially configure a number of settings on your behalf, will alert you about things that perhaps you should know about, even though there may not be any settings for it. And that's in a nutshell where we are. So I think I've taken already a lot more time than I should. And perhaps I should just jump to the conclusions of this talk. So what have I tried to do? Well, I've tried to convey to you that privacy seems to matter to people. That's certainly a consistent theme in all the studies that we've conducted. There are a few people, there's a meaningful percentage of the population that tends to be on the fairly loose end of the spectrum and is willing to agree to lots of things. There are also an equally substantial percentage of the population that's fairly conservative and tends to say no to most things, but the vast majority of the population is somewhere in between. And those people have diverse preferences. Even though they're diverse, when you look at them more closely, you can actually organize them in a relatively small number of clusters and get quite a bit of mileage out of that. And so we view this as being very promising. We've also been able to build more sophisticated models for individual users, getting even beyond that 80% accuracy that I showed you earlier. And we really believe that, honestly, if we're going to retain privacy and remain in control of our information as we move into IoT, this is probably the only way to make it happen. I cannot think of any other solution. I mean, the other solution would be to regulate and say all these scenarios are not allowed. That's never going to fly with industry. It's never going to fly with all the people who are actually adopting these technologies. Right? I think that's the only way that we can hope to reconcile privacy and usability. And that's where I'm going to stop. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Noam, for this excellent presentation. We can still take very few questions. We have an innovation. We have a mic there. So please raise and give me back the mic right
Of course. So did you have any problem with users that were actually disabling core functionality, for instance, like taking location away from maps, something like that? And if so, did they immediately add it back, or do you have any data on that?
So this was the reason why, for a while, Google was not sure that they wanted to actually offer this functionality to its users. Their concern, and I had very long discussions with them about a year ago was that if you gave people the ability to turn off some of these permissions, some apps would stop working. And that's true. What we found in our studies is that people had reasonable mental models about what they could turn off and what they shouldn't turn off. Occasionally, a few people would turn things off that they had to turn back on. But that was actually the exception, more than the rule. And when I shared my statistics with Google, they said, interesting. We didn't think that this would be the way it is. My recommendation to them remains that they should actually expose to people permissions that include purpose, because ultimately people's preferences are tied to purpose. And so there's clearly a dilemma today when you have an app that collects your location both for navigation and advertising, right? And people may not feel comfortable with the advertising side, but they might feel very comfortable with the navigation side. They right now have essentially one choice that bundles these two decisions, and that's just not right.
Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. In addition to the allow suppress model, did you consider adding noise to the data or randomness to the data to allow for more privacy for the users?
So that's an entirely, that's a very good question, right? So this is about differential privacy, right? And clearly there are a number of people who are looking at increasing your privacy by including noise in the data. You can also build architectures so that potentially reduce the amount of information that you disclose. Suppose that you want to have, for instance, a location-based recommendation for restaurants. One option is to give your GPS lat and long, right, and get the restaurants within a small radius. The other is to say, well, just give me everything in this very broad area without disclosing your location. So there are different techniques along those lines that are possible. And what one would want to do is then start modeling people's privacy preferences with regard to these slightly different trade-offs. And my best guess is that you would still find that people have diverse preferences. Conservative people would probably still remain conservative, but to the extent that you can present this in an understandable manner, you might find that more people are comfortable sharing more information under those contexts. Yes? Yes?
I suppose it is very difficult to enforce privacy setting with purpose, or if that app is not using some well-known third-party library. It can collect something and say that it's internal use, but it actually they do something else. And I suppose it's very difficult to have any possible solution to this.
So I think there are multiple dimensions to your question. I think that you suggest that perhaps someone could effectively be trying to deceive the user by requesting a permission without disclosing the purpose. And so certainly, there are expectations that when you disclose information, you're not going to be lying. If you lie, then this is going to fall under deceptive practices, and the FTC comes after you. So if your privacy policy says that we only collect your location for the purpose of the app being able to deliver its functionality, and in truth you also share that location with others, and you state that you are not, then you're clearly falling under deceptive practices, and you're potentially subject to a process with the FTC and others. Now, you have, and iOS has actually introduced this over the past, about a year and a half ago. In iOS, developers now can actually enter information explaining the purpose for which they're collecting information. They don't give you control over that, but they at least give you the option of providing that explanation. There's been studies looking actually at the impact of providing these explanations. In general, when you provide an explanation, if it's reasonable, you're going to increase the chance that people are going to feel comfortable disclosing information. If it's unreasonable, then it might backfire, obviously. I think there were other elements to your question, but I'm trying to remember what they were.
If that it is not implemented with some well-known third-party library, so then how do you tell the purpose by its own?
So ideally, right, so right now, the purpose, we've effectively inferred the purpose by analyzing all these apps, right? In an ideal world, you would want the apps to declare that, right? And you would want to, right? So that would be the ideal scenario as far as I'm concerned. I think that it's the responsibility of the app stores to potentially impose those kinds of requirements. App developers, by the way, most app developers, there are extensive stats about this. Most app developers are two guys in a garage. Many of them don't even have a college education. Two guys in a garage, they don't have a budget to hire a lawyer and write a complex privacy policy. So in this space in general, I think the onus is on the app stores, Google Play and the iTunes Store, to raise the bar, offer developers tools. There are actually tools today that help developers build privacy policies by just answering a few questions. But even that by itself is not sufficient. I see this in my class. I teach mobile and IoT every spring, and I get people to build apps, and then I ask them to build a privacy policy for the apps that they build. And they always make, this is after I give them a lecture on privacy, and I tell them what they should be looking for, and they always make mistakes, right? So for instance, they will say, I collect location information, but I do not share it with any third party. And I say, what is that map where you're displaying that location? Oh, that's Google Maps. And I say, isn't that a third party? Oh yes, I forgot that. And how about Facebook for authentication? Don't they collect some information also? Oh yes, I forgot that too. So developers are not very sophisticated, as it turns out. And the only way in which you're going to be able to ensure that good privacy policies and the right permissions are being exposed is by giving developers probably better tools. So if I were, for instance, Android, I would actually refine my existing Android Studio tool and include in there some static analysis that actually identifies. This can easily be done. We know how to do it. I can't imagine that Google wouldn't know how to do it. So build tools that will actually help people, developers, write privacy policies that more explicitly indicate what they're doing with the data they collect, and then expose settings accordingly. Right? So I think that's the way it should go. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but that's certainly what we're advocating. Go ahead. Yes.
Do you make a distinction between privacy and security? Because these are two different concepts related. So
Right.
a number of things that you're mentioning seem to be more in the context of security, and then rather than privacy. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Okay. Well, I could probably talk about an hour about the difference between privacy and security, but I would potentially say that certainly the privacy issues that I've discussed today have security implications. And obviously, so the information that you can collect through apps can in turn be used to compromise some of your accounts, obtain sensitive information about you. Location information, might help me stalk you, might help me understand your habits, might help you if I'm a government that tries to spy on the people in the country. I might be able to use that to infer whether or not you're attending some political events, and who else you're meeting with, and those kinds of things. That same information can be used also to launch social engineering attacks. Right, so knowing your contacts list, I could send you a phishing email that pretends to be from one of the people on your contacts list. I could send you a fake phishing phone call, right, pretending, or I could send you a fake SMS message. So there are clearly security implications also to the collection of this information. And obviously another side of this is, an entirely different side, is that all these very sensitive information that's being collected today by developers, very often, location, I think it's about 40 or 50% of the time, this information is sent in the clear, right, while it should obviously be encrypted. So developers, again, are really not very sophisticated. They're doing all sorts of things that are putting our information at risk, not just from a privacy standpoint, but also from a security standpoint. It's a very limited answer, and there are many other paths that I could follow in answering your question, but hopefully that's useful.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid time has run out, but as usual, we have a reception one floor down. So please ask your questions to the speaker on the 5th floor. Thank you very much again.